Greetings, Father Mark signing on, beginning a new course in church history. This is for the seminary, but of course, I'm going to upload it to my channel so anyone who's interested can watch it. For those who are taking this for credit, this is HT 502, the patristic period for seminarians. That's those working on the MDiv. For those of you in the MA program, this is HT 611, Fathers of the Church. So it's the same content. It's basically ancient, the history of Christian antiquity. So this is, I'm doing it this way because we're still in COVID world. The seminarians are going to be quarantined until at least January 30th. So the first 2 weeks of class, and then it'll be reevaluated. So I'm uploading this now, so seminarians, you can watch this at your convenience. I uploaded the syllabus with the course requirements and the books on the Google Classroom site, to which you've been invited. And if you have any questions about that, email me directly at my NDS, my seminary address. So this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to introduce this course, but this is also, since all the courses I teach at the seminary are sequential, this is the ancient history, then it'll be the medieval, then the modern, then the American church history. So this is going to be the introduction for the entire program. So like the next course you have with me, the medieval, I'm just going to start wherever we leave off. So all of this introductory material applies to the entire department, the entire endeavor of church history and historical theology. So treat it as such. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 30, God commanded the prophet, quote, "Now come, write it on a tablet they can keep, inscribe it on a scroll, that in time to come it may be an eternal witness." That's verse 8 of chapter 30. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 36, God commanded the prophet in verse 2, "Take a scroll and write on it all the words I have spoken to you about Israel, Judah, and all the nations, from the day I first spoke to you, from the days of Josiah until today." In the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, the evangelist explained, beginning verses 1 through 4, "Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us," he's referring to Jesus, "just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received." So these are just a few examples of the biblical recognition of the importance of the written word in the life of the faith, to preserve the original eyewitness testimony, to sustain memory throughout the millennia, and to ensure correct teaching. So this course, the course on the patristic period, or Fathers of the Church, depending on which degree you're working on, is only possible because of the myriad writers, some remembered, others forgotten, who followed these guides, who used the written word to create a written body of history and theology. Before delving into what they left us, it is always useful and proper to begin by defining our terms. So we will define the term historical theology and as well as history. as well as the period of historical theology and church history that will occupy our attention, the patristic period. I'll also define what that term means. So, first, theology. The word theology is an elision of two Greek words. The prefix theos means God. The suffix logos means word in the sense of reason. You know, the word's language requires the use of reason, structured thought, an expression of structured thought. So these are structured thoughts and words written and preserved about the divinity, about God. That's general definition of theology. The study of the Word of God, what those words reveal to us about the nature of God, and what God's will is for us. That's a very broad, obviously very broad. So within that broad category, and for seminarians, that'll occupy your whole time in formation. You know, every year you're going to have courses on different aspects of theology. So that's far beyond one particular course. So narrowing that, we in this course will narrow our focus to the particular aspect of God's interaction with creation that may be called salvation history. That is, the story, the written record of God's plan to save the world from sin and death. Now, even that is far too broad for either one course or one department. So we narrow our focus yet again, tighten our focus yet again. A particular interest is the part of that plan of the salvation history, which the church calls divine providence. The word providence is derived from a Latin verb, providere, meaning to see ahead, with a connotation of providing, providence providing for, so to make provision for. So you to see ahead, you're preparing in advance. The church defines divine providence specifically in the Catechism. This is Catechism Number 302. And whenever I refer to the Catechism, the numbers I use will be the paragraph numbers. So that'll be the same regardless of which edition you use, whether you use online or printed version. So this is not the page numbers. Page numbers will be different depending on which printed version. And of course, on the internet, they won't have pages. So this is Catechism, paragraph number 302. Quote, creation has its own goodness and proper perfection, but it did not spring forth complete from the hands of the Creator. The universe was created in a state of journeying, in statu viae, toward an ultimate perfection yet to be attained, to which God has destined it. We call divine providence the dispositions by which God guides his creation toward this perfection. End quote. And so, historical theology, as we will study it in this course and all the other courses that you have with me, may be defined as the study of church history for the purpose of coming to a deeper understanding of the role of divine providence in salvation history. Why do we do this? Well, the stories are interesting, of course, but there's a deeper reason, and there are a number of corollary benefits to this project of studying church history and historical theology, and we will enumerate them as follows. Corollary benefit number 1: sin exists. We must plan accordingly. Yet, as damaging as sin has been and continues to be, it has never succeeded in destroying the church, because the Holy Spirit also exists, and the Holy Spirit has remained with us. In other words, Jesus made a promise, and that promise has been kept. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. Catechism number 386. Just so you know, this isn't just me. I mean, so like we one of the complications of this whole endeavor is that we have to cover history as well as theology. To approach it from a Catholic perspective, because that's just what we have to do. So it means much more content has to be covered. However, it does have advantages, and this is one of them. So, and also, anyway, okay, so the Catechism number 386. Sin is present in human history. Any attempt to ignore it or to give this dark reality other names would be futile. To try to understand what sin is, one must first recognize the profound relation of man to God. For only in this relationship is the evil of sin unmasked in its true identity as humanity's rejection of God and opposition to him, even as it continues to weigh heavy on human life and history. And the next number, 387, skipping down to the end, quote, only in the knowledge of God's plan for man can we grasp that sin is an abuse of the freedom that God gives to created persons, so that they are capable of loving him and loving one another. End quote. So, first, sin exists, plan accordingly. This study will help us do that. Second corollary benefit. Nothing just happens. Applying the Hermeneutic of Continuity, which is the Catholic way, church history can sharpen our use of reason by tracing etiology. So etiology, it's seminarians, you may, I'm sure you cover this in your philosophy, but just to refresh your memory, it's spelled E-T-I-O-L-O-G-Y. It is from the prefix is from the Greek aisha, which means cause. So etiology is the study of cause and effect, causation. So our project can sharpen our use of reason by forming the habit of mind of thinking in terms of cause and effect. Specifically, the causation, the sequence of causation that resulted in the manner in which the church developed in its teaching and as an institution. And there are biblical explanations for this that we can use to build on. A couple of examples. St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 6, verse 7. Make no mistake, God is not mocked, for a person will reap only what he sows. So, cause and effect. Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, beginning at verse 43. This is Jesus himself. The ultimate principle of Christian discernment. Quote, a good tree does not bear rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For people do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor do they gather grapes from brambles. A good person, out of the store of goodness in his heart, produces good. But an evil person, out of a store of evil, produces evil. For from the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. End quote. Now, I referred to the Hermeneutic of Continuity. Now, since this course is for the first year seminarians, first theology seminarians, this is the first time I've had you, and I know some of you, you're coming from different seminaries, so I'm not sure exactly what you've covered. So if you've already had this, please forgive me. But even if you had, it's useful to remember, because again, this is the intro, not only for this course, but for the whole department, the whole way church history will be approached at the seminary. So for this, the Hermeneutic of Continuity, Pope Benedict XVI provided a systematic analysis of this approach in a historical reflection on a particular historical event, specifically the Second Vatican Council. Now that's something that we'll cover in the last course you have with me in fourth year. So here, we're just going to extract from that address that he gave in 2008 only that which is relevant for us at this point. So we'll skip the beginning down to pick up with this quote. The question arises, why has the implementation of the Second Vatican Council in large parts of the Church thus far been so difficult? Well, it all depends on the correct interpretation of the Council, or, as we would say today, on its proper hermeneutics. So I'll pause there. Hermeneutic is a term. It comes from a verb, a Greek verb, hermeneo, which means to interpret in the sense of translate. So it's not only translating words, but also the meaning. So a hermeneutic is just an interpretive paradigm. It's a heuristic. It's a template, an algorithm, whatever analogy you want to use. It's just a method of interpretation. So on its proper hermeneutics, meaning on the proper method of interpreting the council. Back to the quote. The correct key to its interpretation and application. The problems in its implementation arose from the fact that two contrary hermeneutics came face to face and quarreled with each other. One caused confusion, the other silently, but more visibly, bore and continues bearing fruit. On the one hand, there is an interpretation that I would call a hermeneutic of discontinuity, or a hermeneutic of rupture. It has frequently availed itself of the sympathies of the mass media, and also one trend in modern theology. On the other hand, there is the hermeneutic of reform, the hermeneutic of continuity, on the one subject, church, which the Lord has given us. She, meaning the church, ecclesia, she meaning the church, is a subject which increases in time and develops, yet always remaining the same. The one subject of the journeying people of God. The hermeneutic of discontinuity, of rupture, risks ending in a split between the preconciliar church and the postconciliar church. I have a notice. Oh, never mind. Sorry about that. Between the preconciliar church and the postconciliar church. In a word, it would be necessary not to follow the text of the council, but its spirit. In this way, obviously, a vast margin was left open for the question on how this spirit should subsequently be defined, and room was consequently made for every whim. The nature of a council as such was therefore basically misunderstood. The hermeneutic of discontinuity is countered by the hermeneutic of reform, the hermeneutic of continuity, as it was presented first by Pope John XXIII in his speech inaugurating the council on the 11th of October 1962 and later by Pope Paul VI in his discourse for the Council's conclusion on the 7th of December, 1965. Here I shall cite, this is still Pope Benedict, right? Here I shall cite only John the 23rd's well-known words, which unequivocally express this hermeneutic, when he says that the Council wishes to transmit the doctrine pure and integral, without any attenuation or distortion. And he continues, our duty is not only to guard this precious treasure, as if we were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which our error demands of us. And then skipping down, he goes on reflecting on that, some things more specifically about the council, which we'll deal with later in the third year and the fourth year courses. But just sticking with the interpretive paradigm, continuing with the quote. It is necessary that adherence to all the teachings of the Church in its entirety and preciseness be presented in faithful and perfect conformity to the authentic doctrine, which, however, should be studied and expounded through the methods of research and through the forms of modern thought. The substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing. The way in which it is presented is another, yet retaining the same meaning and the same message. Okay, end quote. Now I'll let you, there's some more to quote, but I'll just say, so just to clarify, we do not adapt, so there's some dangerous words. I just want to clarify, like, we do not adapt the teaching. All right, the teaching remains the same. But we can adapt the presentation of the teaching. You know, for example, St. Paul, even though he was Jewish, he wrote the New Testament in Greek. All the books of the New Testament were written in, well, at least the preserved. Matthew, there's a, well, anyway, we could, but I mean, the text as we have it now was all written in Greek. There was not written in Hebrew or Aramaic. So that was a concession, because Greek at the time would be understood by the most people in the most places. Yet I am not teaching this course in Greek. I will refer many times to the Bible, but always in English. You know, once in a while I'll give you the original words just for the sake of, you know, because of a particular meaning. But that's an example. So I'm adapting the method, you know, of presentation. I'm using the current language. I'm using a computer, using the internet. So that's adapting the method, but the teaching doesn't change. That has to be in conformity. So that, okay, let's see, going back to the quote. Then he goes on with some church-state stuff that, okay, the ancient church, which is our interest in this course, naturally prayed for the emperors and for political leaders out of duty. But while she prayed for the emperors, she refused to worship them, and thereby clearly rejected the religion of the state. The martyrs of the early church died for their faith in that God who was revealed in Jesus Christ. And for this very reason, they also died for freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess one's own faith, a profession that no state can impose, but which instead can only be claimed with God's grace and freedom of conscience. A missionary church, known for proclaiming her message to all peoples, must necessarily work for the freedom of the faith. She desires to transmit the gift of the truth that exists for one and all. The steps the Council took toward the modern era, which has rather vaguely been presented as openness to the world, belong, in short, to the perennial problem of the relationship between faith and reason. That is, re-emerging in ever new forms. The situation that the Council had to face can certainly be compared to events of previous epochs. In his first letter, St. Peter urged Christians always to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks them for the logos, for the reason for their faith. This meant that biblical faith had to be discussed and come into contact with Greek culture and learn to recognize through interpretation the separating line, but also the convergence and the affinity between them in the one reason given by God. Okay. So the reference, the quote from the first letter of St. Peter, that's chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. Anyway, so, okay, you get that now. The third corollary benefit of approaching, of studying history in the Catholic way with the Hermeneutic of Continuity. Third is, hopefully, deepening our wisdom and prudence in perceiving current realities in the context of both the natural and the supernatural orders. Understanding, in other words, understanding cyclical stupidity. Because stupidity does it keeps coming back, because as free will exists, and some people are going to misuse it. And the natural and supernatural orders, because that's how God created us. We're both body and soul, so we do have that. And the church is a natural and supernatural order. I mean, we exist. The church is a physical structure. I'm here assigned to a parish church. Yet we also deal with the sacraments, which is conduits of grace from the supernatural into the natural orders. So once again, we have some biblical foundation for this, because the Catholic way is always Scripture and tradition. So Scripture, again, etiology, can see the cause and effect. So the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verses 1 through 13, is the lamentable story of the disobedience in Eden. There's the surrender to the temptation to mistrust God. So that was so before the act of disobedience, there was the internal decision to mistrust God, to disobey God. That decision became an act, original sin. The very next chapter, Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, records the first murder, the first homicide. Cain murdered his brother Abel out of jealousy and envy. Book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 1 through 19, is the story of the golden calf. Yet again, misusing free will, in this case, surrendering to the temptation of pride to limit the divinity to something we could understand, or something they could understand. A golden calf is an idol. So, okay, we can understand that, and then worship that. And that type of temptation continued, throughout, as we'll see, and continues to today. The idea that, we will worship God as we conceive God, not the way that God is revealed. And that was the problem at something like the Pharisees. And as we'll see, one of the reasons they rejected Jesus as Messiah is they had in their mind what they thought the Messiah would be. The Messiah would be another King David. Just as King David freed the Holy Land from subjugation to the Philistines, in Jesus' day, the Holy Land was subject to the Romans. So there were many of the Jews who expected and hoped and wanted a Messiah to be like King David that would kill the Romans and free the Holy Land. But that's not what was revealed. That's what they wanted. And if a Messiah had appeared like that, they would have followed that Messiah. But the way that was actually revealed, Jesus turned the other cheek. The Beatitudes said, no, it's not what they wanted. So they rejected it. Okay, first book of Kings, chapter 12, records a schism of the kingdom. The Holy Land at one point through the reign of three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, was united. Then after the death of Solomon, there was a schism between north and south. And that's recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 12. Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, reigned in the south, Judah, with his capital at Jerusalem, whereas Jeroboam, who was of the tribe of Ephraim, ruled in the north. That became the kingdom of Israel. This religious schism was used to further a political objective, leading to a paganized version of the faith. And that's an early example, but that's one that's continued throughout history. When the faith is misused for political reasons, meaning for reasons that have nothing to do with the faith, if it's misused for that's one category of error. When religion, when it becomes an excuse for civil war and political. All right, so and that leads to, so if a decision is made, someone with a political agenda decides to misuse religion to service that political agenda, then once political power is attained, inevitably the political subverts, mutilates, alters, tinkers with, distorts the religious. So here's the example, beginning in verse 26, 1 Kings chapter 12. Quote, Jeroboam thought to himself, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, the hearts of this people will return to their master, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me. The king took counsel, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he put one in Bethel, the other in Dan. This led to sin, because the people frequented these calves in Bethel and in Dan. He also built temples on the high places and made priests from among the common people who were not Levites. All right, so now you see, so this is a pagan, so in this, the golden calves, it sounds like he's worshiping Baal or something else. But notice that this is what led you off the land of Egypt. So he's worshiping God who saved them from slavery, but worshiping them in a paganized way, using pagan idols, so that to prevent them from going to Jerusalem, which at this point was a rival kingdom, for political reasons, just because he didn't want to, he didn't want to, he was in charge of his own kingdom. He didn't want to lose it. So you see cyclical stupidity and sin. It's all connected. All right, 4th corollary benefit to our study. How to avoid hell and get to heaven. How does it do this? Well, providing insight into our personal task. Well, all of us want to get to heaven, but you seminarians in particular studying to be priests, part of your task and mission will be to explain the church and explain church teaching in the circumstances of not of your life and your vocation, but also explain it to people in the circumstances of their life and their particular vocation. And for that, church history is priceless because it gives you the context. Going back to an earlier point, nothing just happens. There's always a causal sequence. Again, the way the Bible phrases this, one example, the letter of St. James, chapter 1, beginning at verse 13, quote, no one experiencing temptation should say, I am being tempted by God. For God is not subject to temptation to evil, and he himself tempts no one. Rather, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire conceives and brings forth sin. And when sin reaches maturity, it gives birth to death. 5th, connected to it, but it merits a separate point. awareness of the perennial danger of temptation. And it never goes away. So the word temptation, it comes from a Latin verb, at least in the infinitive. Tentare means to test, in the sense of twist, like to test or to twist. Like if you want to see the strength of something, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to break the rosary. But I mean, if you wanted to, you twist it to see how strong it is, to test. So that's the origin, the etymological origin of the word temptation. Temptation is defined as an enticement to sin, whether by persuasion or by the offer of some good or pleasure. It may be external, as was the case of Christ's encounter in the desert, or it may be internal, inasmuch as there is a real assault on the person's power of will. Catechism Number 391, quote, "Behind the disobedient choice of our first parents lurks a seductive voice, opposed to God, which makes them fall into death out of envy. Scripture and the Church's tradition see in this being a fallen angel, called Satan, or the devil. The Church teaches that Satan was at first a good angel, made by God. The devil and the other demons were indeed created naturally good by God, but they became evil by their own doing." It's that choice. Skipping down, Catechism Number 395, quote, "The power of Satan is nonetheless not infinite. He is only a creature, powerful from the fact that he is pure spirit, but still a creature. He cannot prevent the building up of God's reign. Although Satan may act in the world out of hatred for God and his kingdom in Christ Jesus, and although his action may cause grave injuries of a spiritual nature, and indirectly even of a physical nature, to each man and to society, the action is permitted by divine providence, which, with strength and gentleness, guides human and cosmic history. It is a great mystery that providence should permit diabolical activity, but we know that in everything God works for good with those who love him." And that last is a quote from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And Jesus himself, in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, quote, he's addressing those who were opposing him. He said, you belong to your father, the devil, and you willingly carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. When he tells a lie, he speaks in character, because he is a liar and the father of lies. Okay, there are two others, and these are important because of when we move into paganism. First letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, beginning at verse 19. This is St. Paul addressing a recent convert from paganism. "So what am I saying? That meat sacrificed to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I mean that what they sacrifice to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to become participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and also the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and of the table of demons." And I'll explain that, but I wanted, he's referring, St. Paul, is also, he's building that understanding on the Old Testament. So the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, beginning at verse 16, quote, "With strange gods they incited him, with abominations provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons, to no gods, to gods they had never known, newcomers from afar, before whom your ancestors had never trembled." Okay, so as we're going to be encountering paganism a number of times in this course, and as we'll see with the Church Fathers, there are two different approaches. There's some who, like Tertullian, one of the Church Fathers, he just dismissed pagan deities. He said, well, they're just false gods. They're just made up. It's just complete literary fictions. But then there are other fathers of the Church, and they have these biblical passages. That's why I read them as their foundations, in asserting that the pagan gods were not just literary creations, that they were actually demons masquerading as deities in order to mislead. And as Jesus said, you know a tree by its fruit. So some of these pagan cults, as we'll see, promoted activities that are debased, immoral, dissipated, that are all completely contrary to the way life should be lived. Life understood, human life understood as being made in the image and likeness of God, to what we are called to. All right, so keep all that in mind. Now, if this were strictly a secular graduate program, the first course in the department would be titled Ancient History or something like that. But since this is not a purely secular program, and since we must follow both history as well as theology, this is called the Patristics course, or the Fathers of the Church. So that's some more terms for us to define. The Catechism summarizes the Church's teaching that in Catechism Number 65 and 66, summarizes the Church's teaching that public divine revelation ended with the death of the last apostle. According to tradition, the Apostle John, son of Zebedee. And no further public revelation is to be expected before the second coming. So, Catechism Number 65, quote, "In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Christ, the Son of God, made man, is the Father's one, perfect, unsurpassable Word. In him, he has said everything. There will be no other word than this one." St. John of the Cross, among others, commented strikingly on that verse quoted at the beginning, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. "In giving us his Son, his only word, he spoke everything to us at once, and he has no more to say, because what he spoke before to the prophets in parts, he has now spoken all at once, by giving us the all, who is his Son. Any person questioning God or desiring some vision or revelation would be guilty not only of foolish behavior, but also of offending him, by not fixing his eyes entirely upon Christ, and by living with the desire for some other novelty." Now, I should say, there can be and have been private revelations. So there have been different visions like Fatima, Lourdes, where a lady has appeared, or the Divine Mercy, where the Lord appeared. Saint Faustina, the Sacred Heart, to Saint Margaret Mary. But those are private revelations, and one of the criteria by which the Church decides if a private revelation is authentic or not is whether or not they claim to reveal something new. Because that would mean that, well, Jesus left something out. That Jesus didn't address everything. So anyone who does claim that, then it's immediately excluded. That's something that's not worthy of belief. So all of the the private revelations that the church has declared worthy of belief, there's nothing new in them, in the sense that, that like when Our Lady appears, she always calls back to her Son, pray, fast, to do good works, so it's more of reminders of the revelation, calling attention to particular parts of the revelation, rather than saying, oops, Jesus left something out, so here's something new. All right, so Catechism number 66. The Christian economy, therefore, since it is the new and definitive covenant, will never pass away, and no new public revelation is to be expected before the glorious manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Yet, even if revelation is already complete, it has not been made completely explicit. It remains for Christian faith gradually to grasp its significance over the course of centuries. And so, that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the benefits of studying church history, which we'll do. Okay, the New Testament period, so Revelation ended with the death of the last apostle. After the New Testament period, historically, that was followed by the patristic period. The patristic period lasted until the Second Council of Nicaea, met in the year 787. That is the seventh ecumenical council, and the last council to be accepted by both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. The period is called patristic, another term, that's from a Latin word, pater, meaning father, because this is considered the age of the early church fathers. So who are they? Okay, that's another term to be defined. 87 men are considered to be fathers of the church. 49 Greek, 38 Latin. And that's based on the language they used, not necessarily their ethnicity or their geographic location, just the language that they wrote in. And of course, there's some who wrote in both, like St. Jerome. He wrote in both Latin and Greek, but he's considered a Latin father because Latin was his first language. Okay, the Catechism summarizes the importance of the fathers in tradition. Number 77, quote, "In order that the full and living gospel might always be preserved in the church, the apostles left bishops as their successors. They gave them their position of teaching authority. Indeed, the apostolic preaching, which is expressed in a special way in the inspired books, was to be preserved in a continuous line of succession until the end of time." The next, Catechism number 78. "This living transmission, accomplished in the Holy Spirit, is called tradition, since it is distinct from sacred Scripture, though closely connected to it. Through tradition, the Church, in her doctrine, life, and worship, perpetuates and transmits to every generation all that she herself is, all that she believes. The sayings of the Holy Fathers are a witness to the life-giving presence of this tradition, showing how its riches are poured out in the practice and the life of the Church, in her belief, in her prayer. Periods of renewal in the Church are also intense moments of catechesis. In the great era of the Fathers of the Church, saintly bishops devoted an important part of their ministry to catechesis. Catecheo means to instruct or teach, so catechesis is teaching the faith. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, St. John Chrysostom, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, and many other fathers wrote catechetical works that remain models for us. And some of those we'll refer to as the course progresses. Okay, so that ends the quote. So now back to, they are regarded as fathers of the Church because of their contribution to articulation of the faith in response to 3 categories of challenge. Category 1, clarifying the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. Category 2, defending the faith in the pagan context of the world in which the patristic period began, which is the Roman Empire, which is pagan. Third category, contending with erroneous formulations of Christianity, some of which were withdrawn after clarification, others which chose to remain apart. So the word heresy comes from the Greek word erisein, which means to choose. So that's those who have chosen to stay apart. Now, heresy is defined properly. It's a serious sin, so it is defined in the Code of Canon Law, number 7, Canon 751. Quote, heresy is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after the reception of baptism of some truth which is to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. Apostasy is the total repudiation of Christian faith. Schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff or of communion, or refusal of communion with the members of the Church subject to the Supreme Pontiff. Okay, so that's the Code of Canon Law definition, the official Church definition of heresy, apostasy, and schism. Canon 751. Another distinction to be made is that among the 87 Fathers of the Church, 17 are also considered doctors of the Church. All right, so now that we're up to 36 doctors of the Church, but 17 of them lived in this period, the patristic period. So this term, doctor, now because of the medical use, it gets confused. So the actual meaning of the word doctor has nothing to do with medicine. The word doctor is from a Latin verb docere, meaning to teach. So that's the original meaning. In the Roman period, what we would think of as a physician, they would be called a medicus, from the Latin verb, another Latin verb, medere, which means to heal. So the doctors, docere, these are the great teachers of the Church. So this term, doctor of the Church, is a fairly recent usage in Church history. It was introduced in the year 1298 by Pope Boniface VIII, designating 4 fathers of antiquity as doctores ecclesiae, church teachers, creating a liturgical feast in their honor. These were, well, still are, considered doctors, Pope Saint Gregory the Great, that's Gregory the First, Bishop Saint Ambrose of Milan, Bishop Saint Augustine, who was baptized by Ambrose, and the priest Saint Jerome, who's the great translator. In the East, the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI mandated such a feast on the 30th of January for 3 different fathers. These are 3 fathers of the ancient church who were from the eastern part of the empire. This was called the Feast of the 3 Hierarchs. Bishop St. John Chrysostom, Bishop St. Basil he was one of the Cappadocian fathers, and Bishop St. Gregory Nazianzus, who was another Cappadocian father. The West later appropriated those 3 and added to them another Eastern father, Bishop St. Athanasius, creating 4 Western and 4 Eastern doctors of the Church. So 8, originally. The list, as I mentioned, has increased to 36 so far, 36 doctors of the Church. The most recent addition being the Armenian poet and monk, St. Gregory of Narek, Narek, elevated by Pope Francis on the 12th of April, 2015. That was he's Armenian, the saint is Armenian, so that's on the 100th anniversary of mourning the genocide of Armenian Christians by the Ottoman Turks. Okay, so how does one become a doctor of the Church? Three conditions for recognition. Three conditions are necessary to be recognized as a doctor of the Church. Condition number 1, eminent learning. Condition number 2, high degree of sanctity. Condition number 3, proclamation by the Church, meaning either by the Pope or by a council, a church council. And church councils are only church councils if they are in union with the Pope. So, no. Of the 36 doctors of the Church, 17 died before the schism between East and West, which took place in 1054 AD. And those 17 are also honored. They're honored by the they're honored by the Eastern Orthodox as well as the Roman Catholic. So those 17 are the doctors of the patristic period. The patristic period began within the borders of the Roman Empire. The human context within which the fathers of the Church lived requires us to come to terms with this, with their context. So that's the Roman Empire. But to just drop in on the Roman Empire, it wouldn't make, because there's more to the context than that. So to understand the context, we have to familiarize ourselves, at least in a very basic way, with three cultures: the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Roman. And to that, we will now turn our attention. Okay, the Roman Empire. As with all empires, the imposition of unity by Rome on myriad distinct cultures necessarily created an environment of cross-cultural influence operating on multiple levels simultaneously: political, economic, military, linguistic, and most significantly for us, religious. So there are some essential concepts that we have to keep in mind in terms of culture. So the study of cultures is fascinating in itself. In cultures, a lot of surprises, and how these things developed. So there are just a few terms to keep in mind. And for this course, again, and for the rest of church history, because these same issues are going to take place. They're still taking place now, where missionaries still deal with these issues, and dealing with other cultures. So first, defining terms. What does culture mean? Okay, so culture, that comes from another Latin verb in the infinitive, colere, meaning to till, to care for, in the sense of cultivate. Like you cultivate a field, you grow, something that lasts, and endures. So a general definition of culture is a pattern of human knowledge, belief, behavior that is both a result of and integral to the human capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. How a person is formed in their worldview, and how they pass that on, and how they change it as they grow. So there are three terms that sound very much alike, but are not. So the first term is enculturation. Enculturation. Enculturation is the process we all go through. That's the process by which a child absorbs culture, just growing up in the culture. Second is acculturation. That's acculturation. Acculturation is the process of learning the norms of another culture in order to facilitate interaction. So this is, an immigrant moving to another culture, or just somebody visiting as a tourist, or a merchant, somebody who may go back and forth. You still have to do this. You have to acculturate. So this, what are the laws? How do you obey the laws? Taxes, acquisition of language, trade practices, all that is part of acculturation. And third of these that sound alike is inculturation. Culturation is the adaptation of the presentation of church teaching into an indigenous cultural context. So remember, we do not adapt church teaching. Church teaching does not change. Someone adapts church teaching, that's a heresy. We don't do that. But we can adapt the presentation of church teaching, the method of church teaching. The most obvious, when dealing with other cultures is the language, is learning the language, speaking to them in a language they can understand. Okay, a few more terms. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural traits or cultural constructs to other cultures in an environment of active cross-cultural interaction, like the Roman Empire. Language is one obvious example, Latin and Greek. That's how they became so, widely. But also in the Roman Empire, in terms of government, the whole idea of law codes, the church kept that, and we have our own codes of canon law. That's a Roman thing. The military, Roman roads, trade practices, as we'll see, that's how the missionaries, St. Paul followed the Roman roads, to go from city to city. So that cultural diffusion takes place whenever different cultures come together. There's going to be some measure of diffusion, but not everybody is open to that. Not everybody likes that. So those who don't, there's a term for that: cultural dissonance. That is a rejection, sometimes passive, other times violent. A rejection of cultural diffusion. Like I don't want another. I don't want to deal with that, with that culture. And so there's that. Two more terms: synthesis. That's S-Y-N. Thesis. S-Y-N-T-H-E-S-I-S. Synthesis. Synthesis is a combination. All right. Sorry, I gotta pause this. Okay, sorry about that. I thought it was about a funeral that's coming up, but it wasn't. So, synthesis is a combination of previously distinct ideas, whereas syncretism, S-Y-N-C-R-E-T-I-S-M, is a combination of previously distinct practices from multiple cultures. So synthesis is ideas, syncretism is practices. Okay, with all this in mind, now we have all of our terms defined, and if that's it. So now, as seminarians, I'm going to assume you know what all those terms mean. So if you don't, one of the advantages of doing this on YouTube is you can pause it and go back and and review. So for the next 4 years in the courses you have with me, I'm going to use terms like that and assume you know what they mean. So if you don't, review them. And if you review them and it still doesn't make any sense, then email me and we'll talk some more about it. So now we're going to move. We talked about some theology, some Bible, some ideas. Now we go to history. So what follows now is a very brief, painfully, agonizingly shallow overview of the sequence of events that brought these three cultures together: the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Roman, with particular focus on those elements that are going to be an issue during the patristic period. Some were positive, some were negative. Okay, so in Sumeria, which is present-day Iraq, the southern part of present-day Iraq. Yeah. Okay, so it's down. So Iraq, in antiquity, this was called Mesopotamia. between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so southern Iraq down here on the south of the Euphrates River. I dropped it. And that there around 3000 BC, an unknown metalworker created bronze, changed history. He invented bronze by mixing copper with tin in a 9-to-1 ratio and heating it to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. In its liquid state, bronze was suitable for pouring into any kind of mold to create implements for daily use, kitchen utensils, personal decorations, artwork, statues, and inevitably weapons. If I were doing this in person, I've often done it in the past, I'd ask the students, raise your hand if you think the inventor of this used this technology to make the world a better place, and then of course they use it to make weapons. In this last form, the form of weapons, bronze was harder and held an edge longer than either copper or tin alone. Bronze technology left those without it vulnerable, a weakness exploited to create the first empire in human history. Another term to define. The word empire comes from a Latin verb in the infinitive, imperare, meaning to command. The term empire describes an aggregation of territory coerced to obey a central authority, which has no right, other than conquest, to demand such obedience. So to put it simply, empires come into being through successful theft by means of overwhelming force. Depending on the parameters one chooses to apply in crafting a definition, there have been between 60 and 80 such constructs, such empires in human history, that were recorded history. The first, in present-day Iraq, consisting of territories stolen by Sargon I of Sumer and Akkad. So Sargon I gave himself the title Sarukin, which means established ruler. He reigned from around 2335 through 2285 BC, availing himself of the technological superiority of bronze weapons. The significance, why am I mentioning this? Well, the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis informs us that the Hebrews originated in that empire, in the Sumerian Empire. They did not originate in the Holy Land. So, the Bible tells us that Shem, the eldest son of Noah, had 5 sons. The third of those sons was named Arphaxad. He's mentioned in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 12. Arphaxad was the grandfather of Eber, E-B-E-R, who was the ancestor of the Hebrews. So Eber, Hebrew, you see? So Eber was the ancestor of a guy named Terah, T-E-R-A-H. Terah was the father of Abram, and that name was later expanded to Abraham. So he was the father of Abram, later Abraham, the father of Haran, and the father of Nahor, N-A-H-O-R. Terah's family lived in the city of Ur, near contemporary Basra in southern Iraq. So, you see Basra, southern Iraq, there. So the family, the city, was the city of Ur, just city of Ur, near present-day Basra. Terah relocated the family 800 miles up the Euphrates River to Haran. Haran, H-A-R-A-N, was named so by Terah in honor of a son, named Haran, who died at Ur. That's in Genesis 11, verse 28. The move took place during the reign of Lipit Ishtar, who was the fifth king of the first dynasty of Isin, as preserved in the king list of the Sumerians. The divinity, the one true God, summoned Terah's son Abram to leave Haran with his family, his tents, his flocks, to settle in a new land. And this is the dating of this is a subject of much dispute. And it would take us, if this were an Old Testament, but anyway, seminarians, you have Old Testament courses. So I'm following the reconstruction in which this took place around the year 1850 BC. Whatever the date, the event is recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, beginning at first 4 verses. This is the divinity speaking to Abram. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you. All right, now keep that in mind. That's verse 3. All the families of the earth will find blessing in you. So this tells us that from the beginning, the first covenant's going to be formed with, well, there was a covenant with Noah, but that's, anyway, there was a covenant with Abraham. And so from the beginning, the faith is meant for the world. So the Hebrews were incubators of that faith. They kept it alive for centuries of monotheism. But it was always intended to be spread. And so in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 15, they're going to refer to this, invalidating St. Paul's mission to the Gentiles as being part of God's design, not just some adaptation to circumstances of the Roman Empire, but that God always did intend Abraham and his descendants, that all the families of the earth will find blessing in them. Okay, the Sumerian royal road of the time followed the west side of the Euphrates River, from Ur up to Hit, up to Abu Kamal, and then to Haran. The church regards this promise of universal blessing through Abram, at this point, later Abraham, as establishing a covenant that was fulfilled by Jesus. This explains St. Paul's description of Abraham as our father in faith in the 4th chapter of Paul's letter to the Christians in Rome, beginning at verse 16. Abraham, who is the father of all of us, as it is written, I have made you father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into being what does not exist. Paul's faith in the fulfillment of this promise by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus accounts for his confident assertion of that he's preaching Christ crucified. Abraham followed the Lord's command, bringing the Hebrew, well, not all of them, but bringing the subset of Hebrews to whom, and his family, to the Holy Land. This expedition comprised perhaps 300 members of Abraham's extended family and retainers, along with servants, and they brought with them herds of domesticated herbivores. Following the water sources necessitated a wider arc of travel than it would look on a map. Like they wouldn't just go in a straight line from Haran to the Holy Land, because that would be across a desert, and then they'd just get to die. So it's a broader arc following the water, which would be 192 miles southwest from Haran to Aleppo in present-day Syria, then 185 miles south from Aleppo through the Anti-Lebanon Mountains, then 65 miles south through the passes and the mountains to Damascus, Syria, then 88 miles south to Ar-Ramtha in present-day Jordan, then 122 miles across the Jordan River into what was then referred to as Canaan, now Israel, and then south to Shechem. So, in, let's see. So that's, let's see. Well, Haran's not on this map. Oh, well. All right. Well, but you see, Haran isn't on it, but Aleppo is. So you see Aleppo, Aleppo, Syria here. Maybe just like there. And then, God, this print is so small. And then say, okay, so from Aleppo to Damascus, and then just keep going south into the Holy Land. So it was quite the expedition. At Shechem, in the Holy Land, Abraham built an altar honoring the one true God. That's recorded in the book of Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. They then walked 71 miles further south to Bethel, where he built a second altar. Then 107 miles further south into the Negev desert. All that's in Genesis 12. Once he crossed from Ar-Ramtha into, once he crossed the Jordan River, Abraham's clan entered a realm described by the prophet Zechariah as the Holy Land. So that's a biblical term. That's not just, so Zechariah chapter 2, verse 16. In Hebrew, Eretz HaKodesh. In Latin, Terra Sancta. The divinity later described it to Moses in the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus, beginning at verse 17. So I have decided to lead you up out of your affliction in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Holy Land was only able to flow with milk and honey, or indeed to have any life at all, because of a process that occurred 2 miles up, 2 miles above, atop Mount Hermon, the white peaks that gave their name to Lebanon. So the word Lebanon just means shining, white, shining. So the snow-covered, that's obviously what that means. So they melted. The snow melts into drinkable water that spills off the slopes. They spill off Mount Hermon in several channels. They eventually come together to form the descender. So the Jordan, that's what that means. Jordan, the Jordan River, Jordan means the descender. So it's the water descending from Mount Hermon. So the water pauses. Well, it's been terraformed since, but it did in the biblical world. It paused. The descender goes 156 miles south, and it pauses first, pooling into like a swampy lake, the Lake Huleh, Huleh. And then a notch at the opposite side, on the southern side of that lake, permits the descender to escape, to continue its journey south, which is downhill, quenching the parched land. This is not it's not a fertile area. But where the river goes, then there's green. There's a swirling path of green, because water brings life. Then it fills up another bowl, naturally occurring bowl, 9 miles long, 5 miles wide, which the Romans call the Sea of Tiberias, after the second imperator, the second emperor. But to a faithful spiritual heir of Abraham, it could only bear the name found in the Torah. This is Kinnereth, or the lyre-shaped lake. That's in Numbers chapter 34, 10 to 12. And that's where, the Sea of Galilee, in other words, that's the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent some of his earthly ministry. Abraham's family prospered in the new land, growing into multiple tribes. Genesis chapter 16 records that Abraham wanted a son, which the divinity promised. But the passage of 10 years living in the Holy Land without fulfillment of this promise made his wife Sarah worry. She therefore offered Abraham her Egyptian slave Hagar to accomplish this objective, so that Abraham would have a son. So Abraham accepted her offer, and, well, I suppose the polite way to phrase it is that reproduction occurred. Recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. During the gestation period, Hagar behaved in a superior fashion to her owner, Sarah, because she was able to procreate, whereas up to that point, Sarah was not. So Sarah retaliated. She abused the slave to assuage her wounded vanity. So Hagar ran away. An angel intercepted Hagar at a well on the road to Shur, which is the present Wadi Tumilat in northeastern Egypt, and promised Hagar numerous descendants. Hagar returned to Abraham and gave birth to his first son, Ishmael. Genesis 16, verses 5 through 12. Later, in Genesis chapter 21, Abraham had a second son named Isaac, this time with his wife, Sarah. Sarah then insisted on the expulsion of Hagar and her son Ishmael. Abraham caved. Genesis 21, verses 9 through 19. But we'll meet Ishmael again later in the medieval course, the second year. Well, at least his descendants in the second year course. As an adult, Isaac married Nahor's, a descendant. I'll put it Nahor, a descendant named Rebekah. She was the daughter of Abraham's nephew, Bethuel, for which purpose she was brought from her home in Haran. She was part of his family that he left back in Iraq when he came to the Holy Land. But he's still, so he sent messengers back to get, a girl from home, to marry his son Isaac. And that happened. Isaac's son, Jacob, Isaac and Rebekah had a son. Isaac and Rebekah had a son. The son that's relevant for us is Jacob. Jacob married Rebekah's nieces, Leah and Rachel. Jacob's sons, by them, as well as other concubines, became the chiefs of the tribes of Israel, and therefore the ancestors of the Jews. So these are, all this is in Genesis chapters 25 through 35. Genesis chapters 29 and 30 record the evolution of Bronze Age Israelite society into a tribal structure that is recognizable as one distinct pattern of cultural development, such that it even has a name. Ethnologists call it a phratry. That's in English, it's Phratry. Now that's from the Greek, frater, meaning brother, which of course was adopted as a cognate into Latin. Frater means brother. So a phratry is a cultural construct, a genealogical construct, in which the founders of each of these tribes in a confederation were not only related, but they all shared a single apex ancestor, in this case, Jacob. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel in Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 32. So the 12 patriarchs of the tribes are listed in Genesis chapter 35, verses 22 through 26. So I won't read all the names, but you can read those if you Jacob and Leah had 6 sons. So that's 6 tribes, including Levi, the priestly tribe. Jacob and Rachel had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Jacob and one of Rachel's maids, named Bilhah, had 2 sons. Then Jacob and one of Leah's maids, Zilpah, had another 2 sons. Now, of all those, Rachel's sons, Joseph and Benjamin, there is a tribe of Benjamin, but there's no tribe of Joseph. Because Joseph, he's the one that his brother sold into slavery in Egypt. And he married an Egyptian, meaning a pagan. So he's not considered the founder of a tribe. But he had 2 sons. And Jacob adopted those sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. and those are considered patriarchs of two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And they're mentioned in Genesis chapter 48, verses 1 through 20. Genesis chapter 46 and 47 record that toward the end of Jacob's life, around 1630 BC, the Israelites migrated to Egypt during a time of famine. The first chapter of the book of Exodus, verses 8 through 22, explain that a subsequent change in the government of Egypt resulted in enslavement for the Israelites by the Egyptians for 430 years. Now there's a fascinating story behind that, but that would take us too far afield, and that's one story that doesn't. The change in Egyptian government doesn't anyway. So, additionally, with implications that we will witness in the 7th century A.D., Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18, records that Abraham's firstborn Ishmael had 12 sons. They also generated a tribal phratry structure. These tribes spread into the Sinai Peninsula and into the Arabian Peninsula. They became the ancestors of the Arabs. Ishmael's second son was Kedar, mentioned in Genesis chapter 25, verse 13. From Kedar descended a tribe called the Kenana. From the Kenana descended a tribe called the Quraysh. Abu Qasim Muhammad was born into that Quraysh tribe in Mecca, present-day West Saudi Arabia, in the year 570 AD, according to our Gregorian calendar. Muslims believe that Muhammad was the prophet of God, of Allah, and that he fulfilled a prophecy regarding Kedar, son of Ishmael, found in chapter 42 of the book of Isaiah, beginning in verse 11. Let the wilderness and its cities cry out, the villages where Kedar dwells. Let the inhabitants of Selah exult, that's Petra, that's present-day Jordan, and shout from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and utter his praise in the coastlands. The Lord goes forth like a warrior. Like a man of war, he stirs up his fury. He shouts out his battle cry against his enemies. He shows his might. So this is explaining that, this is how the Muslims account for the frequent appearance of warfare in their history. That this is part of the prophecy. Anyway, fast forwarding around the year 1800 BC. That's a half century after Abraham moved to the Holy Land. An anonymous metal worker, another one, discovered a technique for forging iron, invented iron, while working 62 miles southeast of present Ankara, Turkey. At least that's where the oldest specimen of this has been found. This involved repeated heating of the metal to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, interspersed with hammering and reheating using air blown by bellows over charcoal, which magnifies the carbon content of the finished product. So the resulting metal, the iron, is more durable than bronze. It held an edge longer and did not require the extra step of mixing with another metal to create an alloy. A technological advantage over everybody who, by this point, everybody had bronze. So now those who have iron are going to have an advantage over them. This technological advantage opened the lucrative possibility of large-scale theft of territory and resources from unwilling populations who were armed only with bronze. Hence, another empire appears in history. King Labarna I began assembling the Hittite Empire around 1600 BC by using iron weapons to subjugate present-day Turkey, Armenia, Syria, Lebanon, and North Iraq. The history of this empire, the Hittite Empire, as with the history of all other empires, eventually ended in failure. The death spiral of the Hittite Empire followed the trajectory of political cannibalism, meaning internal collapse first, in which the internal population starts slaughtering each other, and only then, once they're weakened from within, do all the people they conquered, resent obviously the subjugation, then turn and attack their erstwhile masters. So that's what happens, when an empire disintegrates following that trajectory, internal collapse first, political cannibalism, in which one group vies for control of the whole, but it becomes so long and destructive that in the end they wreck the construct that they were fighting over. So that happened with the Hittite Empire. It collapsed in around 1200 BC. The period of disintegration and the power vacuum that followed corresponds to the biblical books of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. The spread of Hittite iron forging technology was slow, because it's not, people don't readily share technological advantages with people who don't have them, because they want to keep the advantage. But it eventually did spread. That time of transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was one of great importance in understanding the world in which the earthly ministry of Jesus took place, and the apostles and the early fathers of the church. Understanding that process brings us to the second cultural group we're going to meet, the Greeks. Where are they? The 10th chapter of the book of Genesis identifies the 7 sons of Noah's son, Japheth. And they list them all. One of them, let's see, the fourth of Japheth's sons was a guy named Yavin. The ancient Jews believed that Yavin was the ancestor of the Greeks. Linguists first perceive ethnogenesis of the Greeks as recognizably distinct from everyone else at a place called Mycenae in the northeast quadrant of the South Greek peninsula called the Peloponnese. The Peloponnese. Well, no, never gonna. Let's see. No, Peloponnese. Anyway, it says so. The Peloponnese is a peninsula. It sticks out. It's there's mainland Greece. Then there's a little isthmus, a little narrow strip of land. That's where Corinth is, the Isthmus of Corinth. And then there's like a bulge. It's some say it looks like a bunch of grapes, hanging from a branch, and that's the Peloponnese, that peninsula. It encompasses about 8,300 square miles of mountainous terrain, connected by the land bridge of the Isthmus of Corinth. At Mycenae, during the last phase of the Bronze Age, around 1600 to 1100 BC, the Proto-Greek language appeared in a syllabic form called Linear B, modeled on the writing of Minoan Crete, Linear A. In this language, the Greeks did not refer to themselves as Greeks, but they referred to themselves as Hellenes, named for Ellen, who was the first Greek man. The Greek name for their mainland was Hellas, Hellas. The term Greek originated from a first contact situation, the Romans. So the first Hellenic tribe that the Greeks encountered identified themselves with a word that sounded to the Roman ear like Graeci. So that's the Greeks. So the name Hellene, Hellene, should not be confused with the female proper name Helen, which has one L. Nor should it be confused with the English word hell, that which is derived from a completely different kind. The English word hell is actually derived from an Anglo-Saxon term, Helion, which means hidden or buried, obviously refers to the netherworld. So, in Greek myth, Helen was the son of Deucalion, who was the son of the Titan Prometheus. Deucalion mated with Pyrrha, who was the daughter of another Titan, Epimetheus, who was the brother of Prometheus, and Pandora, the first human female. Reproduction occurred 6 times, 3 sons, 3 daughters. The eldest, Helen, was the apex ancestor of 4 tribes of the Hellenic tribal phratry. So the Greeks, like the Hebrews, their culture developed originally as a tribal phratry, in which the patriarchs of their proto-tribes all shared an apex ancestor. So the 4 proto-Hellenic tribal groups were the Dorians, the Aeolians, the Achaeans, and the Ionians. Visitors. Those of you who have visited the sanguinary pages of the Iliad as part of your education, again, I don't know where you've, but if anyone who has read a page of the Iliad will experience the opposite of surprise to learn that the fellow Greeks destroyed the Proto-Greek kingdom of Mycenae. The Mycenaeans were the first Greeks to develop writing, but the Dorian Greeks were the first to discover the secret of forging iron weapons. And guess what they did with it? Ushering them to prominence in the history of homicide. The Dorian Greeks were the founders, surprise, surprise, of the garrison state of Sparta. They used this iron technology to create a militarized city-state. They conquered and destroyed Mycenaean culture around 1180 BC. Another group of the Greeks, the Aeolian Greeks, identified with Aeolus, who was one of the sons of Helen, as their progenitor. They occupied Boeotia and Thessaly, where St. Paul would later visit. So his letter to the Thessalonians was later there. Achaeus and Ion were brothers. They were the sons of Xuthus, who was the son of Helen. So they all trace themselves to Helen. The Achaeans inhabited the region of Achaea, which is the northern Peloponnese. That's where the Apostle Andrew would later suffer martyrdom. Whereas the Ionians spoke a distinct dialect of Greek. They claimed descent from Apollo rather than Helen. But Apollo Apollo assumed the form of Xuthus, who was one of the sons of Helen, and in that form seduced Creusa, who was the daughter of the king Erechtheus of Athens, and that resulted in the birth of Ion. Athens was their principal city on the Greek mainland, a place that St. Paul visited, as we'll see later in the course. Okay, why do I mention all of this? Well, that last group of the Greeks, the Ionian Greeks, it's because of them that I'm mentioning the Greeks at all in this story. It's because of them that the New Testament was written in Greek. It's because of them that we have philosophy, that we have Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, many, and all that came with that. So how did that happen? Greek trading expeditions commenced, maritime, by sea, commenced, led by the Ionian Greeks. They eventually established 500 colonies on the coast of the seas now named the Aegean Sea, the Adriatic Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Black Sea. This expansion, this colonial expansion, was cyclical rather than linear, meaning that there were centuries that passed with no new colonies founded. And then in one generation, there might be a dozen colonies founded. Mycenaean Greeks began Hellenic expansion in the 15th century BC, with settlements on the islands of Rhodes, Crete, and Cyprus. Meanwhile, an entirely different ethnic group, different language, different culture, everything. The Phoenicians established autonomous city-states in what is now Lebanon. This included the city of Tyre, Tyre, 35 miles north of Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, where, the Capernaum is familiar from the New Testament. So 35 miles north of that is the city of Tyre, the Phoenician Lebanese city of Tyre. 15 miles north of that, of Tyre, is the city of Sidon, Sidon. 49 miles north of that is the city of Byblos, Byblos. And then 24 miles north of that is Beirut. Those are the main, like the proto-cities of the Phoenician Lebanese culture. The Phoenicians also developed a maritime commercial economy as early as 1200 BC, during the Proto-Greek Mycenaean period. So the Phoenicians and the Greeks became economic rivals, but also at times trading partners. And this went on in a dynamic environment. So they both, the competition, one could argue that the competition made both of them, both the Greeks and the Phoenicians, it motivated them to make developments in their ships, in their commercial practices, to expand, found more territory, acquire more resources. So both cultures benefited from it, in other words, and did so until both the Phoenicians and the Greeks lost their independence to a procession of empires from antiquity. So we'll have occasion to visit cities, colonies established by both Phoenicians and the Greeks in this period multiple times in this history. Eventually, Rome conquered all of them, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and all their colonies. By the time of the Roman conquest, 40% of ethnic Greeks lived outside of Greece, tracing their origin to this colonization. These Greek colonies began as emporia, which is the Greek word for a trading base. If it was successful, then that emporia, that trading base, became the nucleus of a polis, a city-state. And in this way, Greek merchants, Greek traders, exported pottery, wine, olive oil, textiles, and traded for them and acquired timber, metals, agriculture, produce, and other, artifacts. Moreover, as we said, diffusion. So this is cultural diffusion. But cultural diffusion is never in one direction. It's always multi-directional. So that, just as others were exposed to Greek culture, then the Greeks were exposed to their culture. And then there's, synthesis takes place in syncretism. So Greek art, Greek ideas, Greek literature, Greek products, pottery, art, and other products, spread throughout all those seas as far away as present-day Spain, France, Italy, North Africa, Turkey. This ascendant cultural influence justifies the ancient description of the region as Megale Elos, or in Latin Magna Graecae, the Greater Greece. The Greek colonies with the longest lasting cultural impact, and the ones of most significance for our story of the Christian history, were on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, the western coast of present-day Turkey. They were collectively referred to as Ionia because they were founded by Greeks who spoke the Ionian dialect. So these included 8th century BC establishments such as Ephesus, to which St. Paul addressed his letter. That's still in the New Testament, as well as cities like Miletus, Smyrna, where St. Polycarp was, Halicarnassus, where Herodotus was from. These Ionian colonies, of course, there were people already there. but sparsely populated. So these Ionian colonies interacted with remnants, fragments of the long-dead Hittite Empire, which included the Kingdom of Lydia, Lydia. And further to the east, they interacted with the Persians in present-day Iran, who became the ascendant power in the region around the year 728 BC, when the Median Empire was created. So the way this happened was the... okay, so here. All right, so this is mainland Greece, and this is the Peloponnese that I referred to, the peninsula down south. See, Sparta is down in the south, and then the little bar of land connecting them is the Isthmus of Corinth. Now, Athens is on the mainland of Greece, further to the north. It is in the mainland. Thessaly's up here. So this is the Aegean Sea. Now, on this side of the Aegean, present-day Turkey, is where Ionia was. There were a dozen cities there founded by the Ionian Greeks, which included Ephesus, which is the western coast of present-day Turkey. So part of the way they did this, metal technology was not the only kind of technology that could be a benefit. There's also naval architecture, specifically galleys propelled by rowers with single mast supporting simple square sails, provided the technological advance making Greek colonization possible. The basic design, the baseline design, was the Pentecost, which just means 50 oared. That was the baseline design upon which all the others developed, perfected first by the Ionian Greeks. It was 100 feet long, 14 feet wide, with 25 oars on each side. It could cover 10 miles per hour in fair weather. Developments included the bireme, which had 2 banks of oars on each side, the trireme, which had 3 banks of oars on each side, and it kept going like that. They had 4, they even had 1 to 5, a pentareme, 5 banks of oars on each side, but all based on that template, that original template of the Pentecost. The bireme and the trireme were the most versatile of those ships, capable of use in either combat or trade, but they were limited by design in terms of their hauling capacity. By the lifetime of Jesus, by his earthly life, with Rome controlling the perimeter of all those seas, the Adriatic, the Aegean, the Mediterranean, merchants, the seas were safer, from pirates, so merchants could fund larger hulled vessels to maximize cargo transport. The Greek version of this was the kakouros, which was it was a hybrid vessel. So one end of it would be a road, like a road galley, but on the other is like built. The other half would look like a barge, so it would have no rowers, but it would just be a barge. They could have a deck, for people on, but then below deck would just be storage. So it would be propelled instead of a propeller like we'd have at one end now. At one end would be the rowers, and they'd propel this barge. So it was not very seaworthy, but it was 250 feet long, a kakouros. It could transport 500 tons of cargo. The Romans later expanded the kakouros into a larger vessel called the corbita, which was 350 feet long and could carry 2,000 tons of cargo. The technology to tack, which means to sail into the wind, did not yet exist. Nor could these vessels remain in open water for long periods. They certainly couldn't handle a storm. So ancient Greco-Roman sea travel consisted of hugging the coastlines by day and pulling the ship ashore at night, unless the weather was very, very calm. Ship captains paid high prices for updated periplou, which is a word means sailing around, but it's an early form of navigation chart. It would list coastal landmarks and safe ports with intervening distances. The Romans produced similar documents for land travel on their roads, itinerarium. And we can use these to reconstruct how the early apostles traveled and how the early fathers of the church traveled. Now, at this point, any self-respecting Phoenician would interrupt to explain that the Greeks stole the design for the original Pentecost from them, from the Phoenician Gola. And the Phoenicians would also say they stole the Gola from us, just like they stole our alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician abacus. The Greeks took all of that. Now the Gola, which the Greeks called gauloi, did look suspiciously similar to the Pentecost, except it was a 20-oared vessel. Instead of 20 oars on each side instead of 25 oars on each side, and still had the quadrangular sail too. Now the Greek, of course, would be offended by this, and he would retort, "Well, Phoenicia is only famous because of a Greek hero, specifically Hercules, or as the Greeks would call him, Heracles, who was the Greek antecedent of the Roman Hercules." So the story was, Hercules, one day, he had a dog, he had a pet dog, and he was strolling along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean one day. He was looking for a sea nymph named Tyro, who's, well, let's say he wished to make her acquaintance. I'll leave it at that. And dogs being dogs, they sniff things and chew on things. Hercules patiently indulged his pet in a favorite hobby of chewing things in the vicinity. So time passed, and then Hercules noticed that the dog's teeth and mouth were stained a deep purple from something it was chewing. So we realized what it was. It was a snail shell. Well, it was getting the snail out, sucking the snail out, it was chewing on that. And that's the murex snail. Hercules obligingly notified the ruler of the nearby city of Tyre, King Phoenix. So Phoenician, Phoenix. So Phoenix founded the city of Tyre, and he's considered the father of the Phoenicians. Intrigued, King Phoenix became the first ruler to use these snails to dye garments purple. Since he was a king, forever after, everyone with money wanted to do the same, associating the color purple with prestige and power. Thereby, Phoenicia entered world history as a merchant thalassocracy, a sea-based merchant empire. Now, a Phoenician, the Greek would tell that story. Well, Hercules showed you that, which made you all famous. Well, the Phoenician would laugh and say that the one who actually did that was the god of Tyre, Melkart, and that the Greeks stole Melkart and just named him Hercules. So, all right, this debate could go back and forth between Phoenicians and Greeks. But all that's significant. So, like Lydia in the New Testament, who helped St. Paul, supported St. Paul financially, she was a dealer in purple cloth. So that's how long this lasted. You see, all these things come together. So the debate about which came first, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, that could go on, it probably will go on into infinity. But remains beyond doubt is that both ancient Phoenicia, north of the Holy Land, present-day Lebanon, as well as the Greeks, developed commercial empires and founded places that are going to not only occupy our attention in this course on the Fathers, but some of the cities are going to continue into the rest of history. Okay. The Phoenicians settled as far away as Spain, and they may have even visited the British Isles, but certainly Spain. We know that because the Romans are going to conquer Spain from them. The Phoenicians converted their abundant cedar forest into a merchant navy, and in their trade they offered wood, ivory, gems, wine, oil, purple dyed cloth to obtain silver from Spain, gold from Africa, and tin from Sicily. They transformed the entire Mediterranean world by regular infusions of these commodities. And they showered innovation on their ships. They invented the mortise joint. They developed caulking between planks. They developed the keel of a ship. We take that for granted as naval architecture. They developed the battering ram. They invented sounding leads, leads, but they were made of lead, to measure sea depth. The crow's nest on the mast for greater visibility, all from this, these early merchant city-states. A perfected version of the Phoenician gola could average 6 to 10 miles per hour and could travel the length of the network from Tyre in 90 days, from Tyre in present-day Lebanon to Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, then to the southern coast of Turkey, then to the island of Rhodes, then to the islands, either Sicily or Sardinia, Malta, Ibiza, then to Spain, to the silver mines at Agadir, which is what they called it, later became Cadiz, Spain. So they could make it in 90 days from there to Spain. Now, these ships could not survive serious weather, so that means they could not, transport during the storm season. So often they would take 3 months to get there, then they would just camp. They would spend the bad months just there in Spain. They'd even routinely grow crops to supplement the obvious food source of fish. The 10th chapter of the book of Genesis identifies the Phoenicians as descendants of Noah through his son Ham. Verse 6, the descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, Canaan. Mizraim became the father of Ludim, the Anamim. It goes on and on and on. Here we go, verse 15. Canaan became the father of Sidon. And that's Sidon is the city mentioned in this list. That's Phoenician. Mention in the same passage of Canaan and the Philistines brings us back to the Holy Land. But first, we have to get the Hebrews back in the Holy Land, as we last left them enslaved in Egypt, therefore unable to participate in the early colonization of the Phoenicians and the Greeks. The 430 years of slavery endured by the descendants of Jacob ended around 1230 BC, when Moses led them to Mount Sinai, where they renewed and elaborated the Abrahamic covenant with the one true God, last confirmed with Jacob in the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verse 14. The details of this Mosaic covenant, or the Sinai covenant, began with the Ten Commandments, recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, and continued through enumeration of 3 pilgrim feasts each year, listed in Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 through 17. The first such feast is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Passover. That took place in spring, celebrating their escape from Egypt. Significant in Christian history because the Last Supper, celebrated by Jesus with his apostles during his earthly life, was in the context of a Passover ritual. The second feast was called the Feast of Weeks, because it took place 7 weeks, or 50 days, after Passover. That was the offering of the first produce of the first harvest as a tithe, sort of a tithe of faith and trust in God. The third feast was called the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tents, because it took place, it was the final harvest of the year, which was gathered by people who slept in tents in the field rather than walk home just to make the most of the daylight. The second of those 3 feasts, the Feast of Weeks, later called Pentecost by Greek-speaking Jews, because it took place 50 days after Passover. As the generations passed, this harvest feast was correlated with religious history and assumed the deeper meaning of an annual celebration of the Sinai covenant. Because Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, records that the people arrived at Mount Sinai 3 months after fleeing Egypt. So that's not precisely 50 days, but it's near enough to justify the association. By the time of the earthly life of Jesus, the pilgrimage, Pentecost became a pilgrimage feast to Jerusalem, and that was discharged by visiting the temple in Jerusalem, meaning that thousands of visitors from multiple nations spent time in the city each year, including the time when Jesus was murdered, was executed by the Romans. And at the first Pentecost, when the descent of the Holy Spirit occurred, that's how Peter was able to address so many people from so many different places. And as we'll see, that's significant in early Christian history. So the first Pentecost feast that took place after the crucifixion is preserved in the second chapter of the book of Acts of the Apostles. The list of provinces from which the pilgrims came correspond to present-day nations, territory and present-day nations of Italy, from Italy in the west all the way to Iran in the east, and north to the Black Sea and south to Libya. 3,000 of them were baptized as followers of Christ. We're told that in Acts chapter 2, verse 41. Some of those remained in Jerusalem, but many more returned home with news of what they had seen and what occurred, that they were able to hear Peter speaking to them in their own language. Peter's accomplishment in the Holy Spirit was only possible because Moses, in obedience to God's command, led the Israelites out of Egypt, arriving at Mount Sinai, recorded in Exodus chapter 19. They remained camped at Mount Sinai for 2 years and 20 days, departing in the book of Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. So within that time, 2 years and 20 days, the Israelites received the commandment, among others, forbidding worship of other gods or making idols. That's Exodus 20, verses 2 to 6. Yet, in the same time frame, they violated that commandment. Exodus chapter 32, during the infamous episode of the golden calf. Significant because it is a portent of the relentless demonic attack against the faithful. Retrospectively, Psalm 106 lamented, beginning in verse 35. But they mingled with the nations and imitated their ways. They served their idols and were ensnared by them. They sacrificed to demons their own sons and daughters, shedding innocent blood, the blood of their own sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, desecrating the land with bloodshed. They defiled themselves by their actions. They became adulterous by their conduct. To remove any possibility of confusion that this was bad, the book of Leviticus, chapter 17, prohibited any involvement in pagan cults. Verse 7, "No longer shall you offer sacrifices to the demons with whom they prostituted themselves. This shall be an everlasting statute for them and their descendants." Moses explained the reason in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. So here we connect back. I quoted this earlier in the intro. So here we see, the context as a warning, a consistent warning against consistent demonic attack against the faith. Verse 16, "With strange gods they incited him. With abominations they provoked God to anger. They sacrificed to demons, to not gods." Okay, as the texts tell us, these sacrifices included hematomancy, blood magic, through human sacrifice. This macabre practice is recorded also in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 36. "Do not inquire regarding their gods. How did these nations serve their gods? So I might do the same. You shall not worship the Lord your God that way, because they offer to their gods every abomination that the Lord detests, even burning their sons and daughters to their gods." As with all commands, human free will at times accepted and at other times rejected what was best. Fidelity to the covenants of Abraham and Moses was not universal. Therefore, decades after leading the Israelites out of slavery to Mount Sinai, Moses foretold the events about which Peter preached at the first Christian Pentecost. In the 18th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses prophesied, verse 15, "A prophet like me will the Lord your God raise up for you from among your kindred. That is the one to whom you shall listen." St. John, in the first chapter of his gospel, informs us specifically that when he and the other apostles recognized that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy of Moses, verse 45, Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one about whom Moses wrote in the law and also the prophets, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." The Old Testament records continual, endless temptations from surrounding pagan cultures. Famously and tragically, the first book of Kings, chapter 11, admits that even King Solomon, the guy who built the first temple in Jerusalem, surrendered to these temptations. 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. King Solomon loved many foreign women, besides the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, from nations of which the Lord had said to the Israelites, "You shall not join with them, and they shall not join with you, lest they turn your hearts to their gods." But Solomon held them close in love. He had as wives 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and they turned his heart. When Solomon was old, his wives had turned his heart to follow other gods, and his heart was not entirely with the Lord, his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, meaning Phoenicians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord unreservedly, as David his father had. Solomon then built a high place, to Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and to Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain opposite Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. It continued in the New Testament. The New Testament continued right at the beginning. Satan tempted Jesus himself, recorded in the first 11 verses of Matthew chapter 4. In that passage, Jesus showed the way to overcome demonic temptation of this sort, which still continues to today. So in that passage, that I just read, we've already met the Sidonians, those are Phoenicians. The others, the Moabites, the Edomites, and others. That brings us back to the Holy Land after the Israelites returned from the Exodus, where they had the misfortune of meeting the Dorian Greeks. Remember them? Mentioned them earlier. That was one of the 4 Proto-Greek tribal linguistic groups. The first to discover iron, and those who constructed the garrison state of Sparta, the most militarized of the Greeks. At our last encounter, the Dorian Greeks were the first of the Hellenes to discover the secret of forging iron, which they applied to weapons manufacture and to destroy their fellow Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks. After which, seeking easy plunder with their technological advantage, Dorian Greeks spread across the Mediterranean world, destroying more culturally advanced but militarily weaker societies, just as they had the Mycenaeans. One group of iron-using Dorians invaded the Holy Land in this period. They call themselves the Peloponnese. The Old Testament refers to them as the Philistines. They conquered and occupied the southwest of the Holy Land, that's today is the Gaza Strip. The first book of Samuel records the Philistine invasion of the Holy Land, and they're guarding the secret of iron forging. That's in 1 Samuel 13, verses 15 through 22. Around 1050 BC, the Philistines conquered Shiloh And more humiliating than that, they captured the Ark of the Covenant. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 4 through 11. And they asserted hegemony from their city-states in Gaza. They're typical, it's a Greek thing. They established city-states in Gaza. And from there, they established hegemony over the rest of the Holy Land. The first book of Samuel, chapters 1 through 6, preserves the humiliating details. Samuel served as the spiritual leader of the tribes of Israel through this generation of subjugation to the Philistines, lasted from 1050 to about 1020, before the Israelites really struck back. Inevitably, the Israelite tribes became restless, and they demanded a king to drive out the invaders. Samuel warned them, that an earthly king of their own choosing would mean loss of freedom. It would mean conscription to fight in his wars, property confiscation, tax theft, and social stratification, with the king and his favorites parasiting off of those they dominated. 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning at verse 10. Samuel delivered the message of the Lord in full to those who were asking for a king. He told them, "The governance of the king who will rule you will be as follows. He will take your sons and assign them to his chariots and horses, and they will run before his chariot. He will appoint from among them his commanders of thousands and of hundreds. He will make them do his plowing, his harvesting, his produce, and produce his weapons of war. He will use your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will tithe your crops and grape harvest to give to his officials and his servants. He will take your male and female slaves. He will take your best oxen and donkeys and use them to do his work. He will also tithe your flocks. As for you, you will become his slaves. On that day, you will cry out because of the king whom you have chosen. But the Lord will not answer you on that day." So they were warned, but they ignored the warning. This was the background for Samuel anointing Saul as the first king of the 12 tribes. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 26 and 27. This began the 20-year reign of Saul, from around 1020 to 1000 BC. When Saul fell from God's favor, Samuel anointed David as king. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13, who eventually, took a while, but he eventually did liberate the Hebrew tribes from the odious Philistine hegemony. He captured the city of Jerusalem from the pagan Jebusites to serve as the capital of a united kingdom. He reigned from around the year 1000 to 961. And we get that time frame from 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. In terms of our story, from the life and reign of David, there are many things, but for our story, his life and reign were a milestone in the history of the covenants. We last visited the covenant during we saw the Abraham and Moses. Now we have another. So God instructed the prophet Nathan to reveal a covenant with David. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning at verse 8. "Now then, speak thus to my servant David. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the flock, to become ruler over my people Israel. I was with you wherever you went, and I cut down all your enemies before you, and I will make your name like that of the greatest on earth. I will assign a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them in it to dwell there. They will never again be disturbed, nor shall the wicked ever again oppress them, as they did at the beginning. And from the day when I appointed judges over my people Israel, I will give you rest from your enemies. Moreover, the Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days have been completed, and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, sprung from your loins, and I will establish his kingdom. He it is who shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. If he does wrong, I will reprove him with a human rod and with human punishments, but I will not withdraw my favor from him, as I withdrew it from Saul, who was before you. Your house and your kingdom are firm forever, because of me. Your throne shall be firmly established forever. In accordance with all these words and the whole vision, Nathan spoke to David. Significant for us, because the covenant with David, along with those of Abraham and Moses, need never be a source of confusion for Christians. Because in this case, we have the convenience of one part of the Bible explaining another part of the Bible. Specifically, the Gospel of Matthew in the infancy narrative, Matthew 1, verse 1 through 2, chapter 2, verse 23, establishes the continuity, remember the Hermeneutic of Continuity, the continuity of the birth of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies contained in the covenants. It consists, as you may recall, of genealogy. It presents the coming of Jesus as the climax of Israel's history and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Beginning in its very first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, quote, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." See, the continuity. Likewise, the Gospel of Luke. The continuity was also specified. Chapter 2, verse 11. "For today, in the city of David, a Savior has been born for you, who is Messiah and Lord." As Savior, Jesus rescued humanity from sin in accord with his Father's will. Even his earthly name teaches this. Yeshua means Yahweh saves. Now, Messiah, what does that mean? So the Hebrew Messiah means anointed one. That's translated into the Greek New Testament as Christos, also means anointed one. So Jesus Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's his title, is the anointed one. One problem during the earthly ministry of Jesus arose because of a prevailing interpretation of the Davidic covenant as promising a Messiah like King David, who would liberate the Holy Land from the hated Roman occupation, as David had done in his time against the Philistines. As we shall see, not only Jesus, but also the apostles and some of the early church fathers suffered because of the persistence of this belief. Now, returning to the ancient monarchy. The second chapter of the first book of Kings records, verse 10, "David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. David was king over Israel for 40 years. He was king 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Then Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingship was established." So this occurred in the year 961, beginning the 4-decade reign of the Holy Land's third Malek king. Now, we've already alluded to the lamentable end of Solomon's reign, when his political marriage alliances with surrounding pagan nations prompted him first to allow and then to support pagan cults in the Holy Land. But at the other end of the spectrum, he enters our story for another reason, his positive achievements. In the 4th year of his reign, he commenced construction in Jerusalem of a temple to the one true God. This allows us to reconnect with Phoenicia, present-day Lebanon, north of the Holy Land, which we last visited in the context of their commercial and maritime competition against the Greeks. Phoenicia, like Greek Ionia, flourished from their endeavor, such that King David had formed an alliance with Hiram of Tyre, who reigned over the city-state, the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, from 980 to 947 BC. Solomon continued this arrangement and availed himself of Hiram's craftsmen as well as Lebanese cedar trees to construct the temple in Jerusalem, for which Solomon paid with wheat, olive oil, and wine. We're told that in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 22 to 25. The full details are recorded in the first book of Kings, chapters 5 through 9, as well as the second book of Chronicles, chapters 2 through 7. It's too long to go into all of that because it's the fact of the temple that's important for us. So I'll just summarize. The project took 7 years, from the second month of Solomon's 4th year until the 8th month of his 11th year. The completion is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 37 and 38. Meanwhile, Hiram of Tyre benefited from his arrangement with Solomon far beyond payment for services rendered. He used Solomon to give himself a market advantage over his Greek competitors. Together, they developed new trade routes, which proved so advantageous that subsequent kings and emperors maintained them, such that they were still present for use by early Christian missionaries like the apostle St. Thomas. So how he got, St. Thomas going to India, that's not as far-fetched, as some anti-religious, anti-Catholic scholars like to pretend. So it began in Elath. Well, this map is so, but, okay. So here is the Holy Land. So what I'm pointing, this is the Red Sea. See? So the Red Sea. So from the Holy Land down the Red Sea, you see Africa on one side, Saudi Arabia on the other side. Then when you exit the Red Sea, on one side was the kingdom of Sheba, on the other side the kingdom of Seba. Then you cross, go around the southern coast of Arabia, cross the Persian Gulf, and then go to India to Bayapur. This is a modern map, so it's not on this map, but it's present-day Kerala state in India. That happened as far back as Solomon, 9 centuries before Jesus. So the Apostle Thomas going there is not at all far-fetched. So it began in Elath, which is a port on the Gulf of Aqaba. That's a channel that leads into the northern part of the Red Sea. The whole project is summarized in the 9th and 10th chapters of the first book of Kings. Initially, Hiram paid Solomon a retainer of 120 talents of gold for the use of the port of Elath, which gave him access to the Red Sea, and secure transport through Israelite territory. So 120 talents, what does that mean? 1 talent was 75 pounds of gold. So 75 pounds of gold times 120. In return, through Hiram, Solomon gained access to the whole Mediterranean commercial network, which we reviewed earlier that the Phoenicians had already developed over the previous centuries, which gave Solomon access to the circuit of ports all the way to Spain and back. The initial forays on this southern endeavor from the Red Sea to the Indian, all the way to India, proved to be so lucrative that Hiram and Solomon constructed an entire merchant fleet based at Elath on the Gulf of Aqaba, which leads into the Red Sea, for the journey to what was called in the Bible Ophir, O-P-H-I-R. That's Bayapur in India in present-day Kerala state. Solomon's profits alone from one of these expeditions was 420 talents of gold. That means 31,500 pounds of gold. That's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 26 to 28. Inevitably, this kind of profit is going to attract attention, which is why I mentioned at the southern end of the Red Sea, you have Sheba and Seba on the two sides, Yemen on one side and Ethiopia on the other side. And north of present-day Ethiopia is Eritrea, and south of it is Somalia. But Ethiopia is the important one because there was going to be a Jewish kingdom there that later became a Christian kingdom. This is the explanation. This Hiram and Solomon's developing this trading expedition from Elath all the way to India and back explains the otherwise startling visit Solomon received from Queen Makeda of Sheba, the Queen of Sheba. Controlling the overland caravan route along the Red Sea coast, she made an impression by visiting Jerusalem with a whole retinue of camels carrying spices, gold, and precious stones for trade. This is 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. She also wanted access to the Phoenician Mediterranean commercial network. But geographically, she couldn't get to it without going through Solomon, because he controlled the Holy Land. So she paid him the same retainer that Hiram did, just an access retainer, 120 talents. Now hers is paid in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 10. In this way, charging for north-south access through Israel, not only to Hiram and Queen Makeda, but also to others that are mentioned, brought Solomon an annual income of 666 gold talents, meaning every year 49,950 pounds of gold. And that did not include the profits he made from his own merchant fleet. Okay, in the history of Christian antiquity, all of this is significant because it explains the otherwise anomalous existence in the patristic period of a Christian kingdom in Ethiopia, in sub-Saharan Africa. At the time, it was called the Kingdom of Aksum, A-K-S-U-M. It also explains the otherwise inexplicable appearance of an Ethiopian eunuch in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, engaged in reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. And all of that together explains, provides the foundation for what became, and still is, the Abyssinian Christian rite. So see, it's all connected, all connected. Okay, elsewhere in the world, entirely without the knowledge of those living under the monarchy in the Holy Land, something happened that's going to affect our history. A cluster of polytheistic beliefs coalesced in the Indus River Valley. These beliefs are named for the river. So the Indus River is the place where the Hindu beliefs came together. It's named for the river. The Hindu, the people of the Indus River. The application of the single term Hindu is just a convenience. It is applied to an array, vast array of staggering complexity over a period of centuries, far beyond our scope here. These early polytheistic beliefs underwent mitosis into a myriad of different Hindu sects. There were three proto-deities for the Hindus: fire, wind, and sun. So those represented three layers of reality. They were then populated, each of the three layers were populated by 33 devas, 11 for each layer. And over time, from those devas emanated thousands, or depending on which sect, millions, literally, of subsidiary deities. All of that's outside of our focus. What is more for us, what's going to eventually affect our history. Classical Hindu thought accepted four proper goals for human life: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Dharma corresponded to ethics, correct living. Artha, just the practical needs of life, work, trade. Kama, rejuvenating the body. And Moksha is the liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. So, for our purposes, what's going to end up affecting Christian theology negatively is Moksha. Is the most important concept of Hinduism that traveled west. Hinduism embraced a radical ontology, meaning a theology of being or existence, that's most conveniently described as dualism, the essential separation of the spiritual and the material. Since the material world is a place of suffering, And everything that dies, eventually, well, everything does die, and everything that does die very quickly decomposes into something that's foul-smelling, and it was regarded as inherently flawed. The material, the physical, is regarded as inherently flawed. Therefore, the goal of existence is to escape to the spiritual world. This escape takes place through a process of reincarnation, cyclically, so in which the soul, if it properly lived according to Dharma in its life, would come back in a higher form, and then a higher, then a higher, then a higher, until eventually it would get so high that it just escapes, and escapes the cycle of reincarnation. So this concept of dualism followed the trade routes into the West. Persia, it was Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and followed the Silk Road into the West. Now, just that idea of dualism is a very easily understood concept. So it was abstracted from its original Hindu context. The full Hindu context is far too complicated to just be transmitted word of mouth by merchants. But that idea of dualism could be. That's something that could stay in the mind and be transported. And it would diffuse, cultural diffusion, it would be diffused into a myriad articulations of Western philosophy and religion that we will cover, and would lead to a plenitude of heresies in Christian history, dualistic heresies, many of which are still with us. So the Catechism addresses this in number 285. Quote, "Since the beginning, the Christian faith has been challenged by responses to the question of origins that differ from its own. Ancient religions and cultures produced many myths concerning origins. Some philosophers have said that everything is God, that the world is God, or that the development of the world is the development of God. Others have said that the world is a necessary emanation arising from God. Still others have affirmed the existence of two eternal principles, good and evil, light and darkness, locked in permanent conflict, dualism, Manichaeism. According to some of these conceptions, the world, at least the physical world, is evil, the product of a fall, and is thus to be rejected or left behind, in parenthetically Gnosticism. Some admit that the world was made by God, but as by a watchmaker, who, once he has made a watch, abandons it to itself, parenthetically Deism. Finally, others reject any transcendent origin for the world, but see it as merely the interplay of matter that has always existed, parenthetically Materialism. All these attempts bear witness to the permanence and universality of the question of origins. This inquiry is distinctively human." Okay, so that's all a quote from the Catechism. So dualism is recognized by the Church as a problem from the beginning. And so now it's why we're tracing its origins. And we'll encounter all these other things. The Manichaeism, the Materialism, all had its origins. There's nothing new. It's nothing new. It just all keeps coming back. But nobody studies history, so they think, oh, wow, and it just came out of nowhere. Well, no, nothing just happens. Remember, nothing just happens. Okay, meanwhile, back in the Holy Land, King Solomon died in 922, 921 BC. The death of Solomon triggered a schism in the Holy Land, which I alluded to earlier. That schism never healed. As we covered previously, Solomon entered into political alliances with surrounding pagan tribes and kingdoms, formalized by means of polygamous marriages, and these wives imported their pagan cults. Solomon constructed temples to those pagan deities. With this in mind, the account of the end of the united monarchy in the 11th chapter of the first book of Kings becomes understandable as a consequence of idolatry, which, as we've already covered, is a perennial tool of the demonic. So 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning at verse 26. Solomon had a servant, Jeroboam. That's Jeroboam. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, with a widowed mother named Zeruiah. He rebelled against the king. This is how he came to rebel. King Solomon was building Millo, which is a palace, closing up the breach of the city of David, his father. Jeroboam was a very able man, and when Solomon saw that the young man was also a good worker, he put him in charge of all the carriers conscripted from the house of Joseph. At that time, Jeroboam left Jerusalem, and the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, met him on a road. The prophet was wearing a new cloak, and when the two were alone in open country, Ahijah took off his new cloak, tore it in 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I am about to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and will give you 10 of the tribes. He shall have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. For they have forsaken me, and have bowed down to Astarte, goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, god of Moab, Milcom, god of the Ammonites. They have not walked in my ways, or done what is right in my eyes, according to my statutes and my ordinances, as David his father did." So skipping down, when Solomon tried to have Jeroboam killed, Jeroboam fled to Shishak, king of Egypt, another pagan. He remained in Egypt until Solomon's death. Solomon rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. Okay, the northern tribes followed 19 kings, ultimately based at Samaria. The first capital was Shechem, then Penuel, then Samaria. So that's Jeroboam the first through King Hosea, which is not the same as the prophet Hosea. The southern tribes followed 20 kings with Jerusalem as their capital, Rehoboam through Zedekiah. The political secession of the 10 northern tribes was solidified by a religious schism described in the 12th chapter of the first book of Kings, which I alluded to earlier when I was doing the different temptations to the demonic. This is so now you can see it more in context, that how and why Jeroboam arrived at the erroneous course of action of creating 2 calves, setting him up at Bethel and Dan in his territory, and have the people go there to worship Yahweh in the form of calves, instead of them going to Jerusalem in the temple. And we know that because of the phraseology. These are your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So it's not just worshiping other gods. He has them worshiping Yahweh, the true God, using pagan forms. The period of the divided monarchy and in the Holy Land can be found in the first book of Kings, chapter 12, through the second book of Kings, chapter 25. It's too much to go into detail. But those things I've covered are things or issues, matters of importance that are going to recur in both in the relationship, between Christians and Jews in antiquity, as well as the relationship between Christians and pagans in the Roman Empire. Overlapping the death spiral of the Kingdom of Israel, developments occurred among the Greeks and the Romans, which had direct impact on Christian history. One familiar date in Greek history around which to orient ourselves is the year 776 BC, the date of the first Olympic Games, hosted by the city-state of Elis, E-L-I-S, in the western Peloponnese, that peninsula, the southern Greece peninsula. Olympics, who cares? Well, they were important for 2 reasons. First, the Olympic Games were pan-Hellenic, revealing that by this point, 776, the Greeks, despite their original differences and their ongoing internal warfare, recognized themselves, thought of themselves as a people distinct from and superior to other people, and that distinctive superiority was worth celebrating. Second, it reveals that the proto-animism and earth worship of the earlier Greeks had developed in the intervening centuries into the more familiar pantheon of Greek mythology: Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, etc. They included a collection of anthropomorphic deities who were immortal and powerful, but who conducted themselves according to a morality that was arbitrary, cruel, promiscuous, and self-serving. The significance being, for our purposes, that Greek religion, Greek polytheism, Greek paganism, provided no ethical guidance for Greek culture. That's a huge lacuna. And that gap, the absence of ethical guidance, morality, would be filled by Greek philosophy, not Greek religion. And so and Greek philosophy is going to have a much longer term impact in our history than the Greek religion. The very next year, 775 BC, is the first datable establishment of another period of Greek colonization, sponsored by the city-state of Chalcis. It was a trading station that they opened, an emporia they opened on the island of Pithecusae, 6 miles off the west coast of Italy. From there, these Greeks, they interacted with the Etruscans, the Sabines, and the Italics, who would later establish Rome. Later, the Greeks established colonies on the mainland of Italy, on the island of Sicily, on the coast of North Africa, and provided new infusions of Greeks to other pre-existing colonies. 20 years later, on the 21st of April, 753 BC, the city of Rome was founded. And that is the third of the cultures that we have to go into. We'll pause there because with the Roman, obviously since Jesus was born in the Roman Empire and the patristic period began in the Roman Empire, we're going to go into much more detail about that than the others. So we'll pause here and we'll pick up with the Roman. Originally it was a monarchy, then a republic, then an empire. So we'll pick up with that next time. Again, seminarians, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And everyone else watching this, any parishioners or friends, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it wasn't. I know I kind of go overboard with the details, but I think that the context is so important. You see, because nothing just happens; it's all connected. If you go deep enough, it's all connected, and then it makes more sense. Anyway, okay, so I'll stop there. Pick up with Rome next time. For now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.